So this next section is called COVID, Climate and Chaos. We are joined by some wonderful panelists. In a way, it's a dream panel for me. It's Hira Khan Adeogun, who is no stranger to the Muslim Institute. She's been to several of our events, including a previous winter gathering, and also Muzammil Hussain, who has just joined us. Warm salams, Muzammil. You also have a long connection with the Muslim Institute, even though you haven't been to the winter gathering physically, so welcome. Before we begin the panel discussion, I thought I'd maybe orient everyone to why this panel. And it all started with conversations that Samia and I were having as she was, putting together the program for the winter gathering. And I said, maybe we should do something about the connections between the COVID and climate crises. And just to rewind a bit, I'm just going to say a bit and then I'll call on the panelists. But if you remember in the beginning of lockdown, I don't know if like me, you were receiving messages on social media or email saying, oh, this lockdown, maybe it's an opportunity to learn. I'm breathing a bit better. The air is nicer. The skies are clearer. I can hear bird song. And there was all this stuff going on, this narrative about maybe this is a chance to slow down. Maybe this is a sign that we have been overtaxing the world. And this pandemic is telling us that we have been over-consuming. And this narrative, I think, was making the connections between, the ecosystemic and ecological links between the COVID and climate crises. And that a lot of this was about lifestyle as well. These were lifestyle issues with both crises. How we move ourselves from one place to the next, transport, what we eat, how do we work, how do we learn, and so on. But then there was a game changer as well, as we realized that many, many more people who were from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, Black and minority ethnic people in the UK especially, were being disproportionately affected by this pandemic. The killing of George Floyd, we've mentioned that before, that also laid bare the idea that the fact that it is more marginalized people who are, made vulnerable by existing inequalities and injustices, who are more susceptible to this pandemic, right? And who suffer more adverse consequences. And this was even in realms like mental health, how it affects you. I mean, being locked down in a big house with good Wi-Fi and a good stash of food is really not a problem compared to being locked down in a tiny cramped space with a family member whom you know is abusive and is going to abuse everyone, and there's nothing that you can do about it. And, who will come back with COVID and doesn't care if they spread it to you. Right? So there were these things that came up as well. There was this justice element that came up really clearly. But at the same time, we knew that governments could do something. They locked down, some of them more quickly than others, some of them more effectively than others. And again, people were making the connection. So COVID and climate are not just about ecosystems and lifestyles. They are questions of justice and injustice. And there are also questions about government action. If governments had taken the climate crisis as seriously as they have taken COVID, perhaps we wouldn't be talking of a climate and ecological crisis at the scale that we are now. And this is where a lot of groups got together, especially in the UK, because we are going to host the United Nations Conference on Climate Change, to talk about a just transition. If we want to come out of COVID, we cannot go back to this old normal where we are burning fossil fuels like crazy, where we are exacerbating equality like never before, right? So, these are, the messages behind campaigns like Build Back Better, the Just Transition campaign, the Green Recovery campaigns that we keep hearing about. So this is where this panel came from. I thought maybe we could look back and try and draw together the links between these issues. Because, all these crises, they need individual action. We've been talking about agency, but they are also structural and they are functions of power and exploitation and injustice. And so with me today, I have two amazing panelists. I've already told you who they are, Muzammil and Hera. In an earlier call when we were preparing for this session, we all agreed that we are passionate about this issue, but none of us actually sees ourselves as experts, right? So we care about the issue, we work on it from different angles, but there are things we don't know. And I thought maybe the best way to do it is to start with each of us saying how we've come to this. I will hand over to them briefly. My 5-minute intro is up, but I'll just say a bit about myself and how I've come into this sphere. So I am now the director of an interfaith network that works on climate change. It's called Faith for the Climate. The founder of this network is actually on this call now, Canon Giles Goddard, who is also a vicar of St. John's in Waterloo, and is also a fellow of the Muslim Institute, and wrote for the climate issue of Critical Muslim, among other issues that he's written for. So we've talked about how interfaith work can be quite, it can be quite lowest common denominator. It can be quite, oh, let's just all have tea together. This is not what Faith for the Climate is about. It really is about people of different faiths who are struggling to make a difference either within their own congregations or with their communities in other countries and this country, or with their own religious leadership. And what they want is to come together in this space and work together to find solutions either for their own religious communities or for their own activist networks and with each other as different faith groups. So the theme of climate justice runs really strongly throughout our work. The way that I came into this was in the 1990s, I studied for an undergraduate degree in Australia in chemical engineering. And I was sponsored by the Malaysian oil and gas company Petronas. And the reason why I accepted the scholarship was, believe it or not, I was rebelling against my parents' expectations. I have 2 older siblings who are doctors, and I was expected to be a doctor as well. So, but I really wanted to rebel. I rebelled by becoming an engineer because it was still acceptable within my aspirational Asian middle-class family. But then when I was halfway through my studies and I was trying to research for jobs in the oil industry, I learned about the assassination of Ken Saruiwa, who was a Nigerian environmentalist and human rights activist. And he was assassinated alongside other activists by the Nigerian military government with the collusion of Shell. And this is when I learned this is what the oil industry does. It doesn't just exploit finite fossil fuels, it also commits the most egregious environmental and human rights abuses. A few other things happened around that time. Deputy Prime Minister in my country was sacked. 9/11, different things happened. I got involved in activism. A lot of it was progressive Muslim, human rights, but the connection between human rights and the environment was always very live for me. So when this opportunity became available to work with Faith for the Climate, I grabbed it with both hands. So this is what I'm bringing today. I was wondering, now I'd like to open it up. Maybe Hera, you want to go first, and then I'll call on Uzma. What brought you to this point today?
Salams everyone, hello. Thank you so much for that introduction, Shannon. And thank you all so much for your time and the interesting conversations and debates we've all been having. Yeah, so I'm going to start with identity because that's kind of where we started in our conversations this morning. So I was born in Lahore. I was brought over to the UK when I was just a baby. I'm a millennial, so I was born in the 90s. And so the idea, it's not just eco-anxiety, it's sort of climate trauma that I think millennials and Gen Zs, and it's just going to get worse and worse as generations go by. Like the threat of the climate crisis has been lurking for a long time in my background. But then there's also the sort of, going back to the identity thing, it was always, are you British? Are you Asian? And then 9/11 happened and British Muslim became more of a thing. And I always had tensions with the British part, but the bit that I was very, very comfortable with was to say that I'm a Londoner. And that felt like home because that's what I've known, that's what I've grown up in. And on reflection, I think whilst I was very concerned about the environment, the climate movement or the people that were campaigning for, climate activism, things like that, seemed very exclusionary for this city kid looking in because, without wanting to be too flippant, it seemed to be a lot of middle-class hippies who were really earnestly concerned about sort of donkeys in the world and sort of things like that I just couldn't relate to. And I think over time, I came to realize that actually there is a false dichotomy that's created between what is nature and what is humanity. And particularly in Britain, humankind has changed the landscape so much that what is natural is really a question. Like, you know, what, like even our coastlines, our rivers, our forests, anything that you think of that is nature, you know, we've got our fingerprint all over it. And so I started to get more involved, and I became trustee of the Women's Environmental Network. And so we work predominantly with women of colour in cities, making the connection between gender, the climate crisis, and inequalities. And so I was doing that for a couple of years. And similarly to Shannon, I got really involved in sort of Muslim identity and, you know, looking at Muslim communities and what does it mean. And because Women's Environmental Network is based in Tower Hamlets, a lot of the women we interacted with were also Bangladeshi Muslim women. And then when this opportunity came up, which is where I'm at now, it's called Head of Car-Free Cities. And I'll talk more about that because it freaks people out, like, what, car-free cities? What does that mean? You know, I grabbed it with, you know, I really grabbed it because I think it's interlinking a lot of the issues that I work on. It's interlinking, you know, the climate crisis with inequalities, with cities and urbanization, transport policy, air pollution. It's a massive, massive, complex interlaying issue. But looking at it through a sort of city lens. So, you know, why, you know, car-free cities? It's because cars are probably just as bad for humanity as smoking is when you think about it. In terms of sort of toxic air, in terms of, you know, how many people die in a year because of toxic air? I think in Britain it's like 40,000 in a year. And when you think about, you know, COVID-19, we're at the point where 50,000 people have died this year of COVID-19 in Britain, but 40,000 people die every single year because of toxic air. And then you kind of think about, okay, whose lives matter? What issues kind of come to the fore? I mean, it's all interlinked. It's not really a competition, but it's an interesting fact that maybe, I mean, even when we look at collision deaths, 100,000 people are seriously injured in the UK because of car collisions. But the way we kind of think about that issue, it's very, very different. We kind of, you know, it doesn't even register. It's just a number. We all have a car, we all need cars, etc., etc. So I work for Possible, which is a climate action charity. And I guess Possible's mission is a zero carbon Britain built by and for everyone. Our campaigning is purposefully very, very positive. I mean, I work at Possible. I'm not really here in Possible's capacity. I'm giving you my own opinions here, but I'm just telling you what they're about and what they do. And we don't campaign about an issue unless we have a solution for it. And I think car-free cities, not car-free intra-city, another thing people kind of get lost on it. So we're talking about car-free cities is one of our projects. I think that's my 5 minutes.
Thank you, Hera. That's wonderful. I mean, huge respect. And I love the Women's Environmental Network. And Possible as well, I think, was one of those groups that was responsible for putting climate change on the agenda in the British elections for the first time last year. If you remember, there was this debate, the live televised debate. Yeah. That was the first time that had ever happened. And one of the groups responsible for it was Possible. So thank you. Muzammil, would you like to say a bit about how you got here? What do you do now? Who do you do it with?
Great. Thank you, Shannon, Hera, Muslim Institute, Samia. And it's kind of funny coming into this at the end of the previous session, which seems to kind of connect and move into this in a beautiful way. And I guess that's an underlying reality that things are interconnected. They're not boxed. And my own journey I didn't rebel in the same way Shannon did. I did some micro rebellions. I became a doctor. But in in my final year is when I got activated into ecological justice in 1996. I was at the Royal Free Medical School in London. And I was hearing that genetically modified food were being imported into the UK unlabeled from the US. And I was with a particular network that got concerned about that. And that's what activated me. And I began to think, where does my power lie? We've got Friends of the Earth, we've got Greenpeace, which were the two most vocal ones at the time. But you know, what can I do that you know, kind of adds to that, you know? And so I began to sort of explore Islam and the ecology and GM food, and became a kind of GM food and Islam man, whereby I got a website together and began to give talks on that subject. Then began to kind of realize that if we're going to make a difference, we have to come together and organize. And that's when I started what was the UK's first local Islamic ecological justice group, which is what's called the London Islamic Network for the Environment. It's evolved into Wisdom in Nature. And there's sort of a story which I may or may not touch on as to why that name change. It also, while it was based in London, I had moved to Brighton, and this was a sort of peak of the anti-war movement, and all the sort of justice groups were coming together, sort of Middle East, and I got involved with the World Development Movement, trade justice, peace, environment, and so there's a huge hotbed of learning. And that's what inspired me to kind of take what I was learning on the grassroots with anarchists, with sort of, you know, all sorts of different ideological activists, and look at how can this work with a group that is Islamic. And I want to be clear, it's not a Muslim group, it's an Islamic group. We're open to people of all faiths and beliefs who can work within that framework. So this group started, I think 2004. And then, you know, we didn't have a map. We were kind of quite pioneering. And that was both a challenge. We would meet regularly every month in London, you know, would have to make decisions and so forth. And so how do you function as a group? You know, it's something that's often overlooked. But you know, what is it that gives us value as a group or an authority to campaign? You know, are we any better than anyone else? You know, are those in government actually, you know, less competent than we are? You know, and one thing I began to be very conscious of myself is okay, here we are opposing certain things and going for certain solutions, but that which we criticize, are we more democratic? For instance, if we challenge politicians for not keeping true to their word, or that not actually embodying a democratic system that they are putting forward, then is that something we're doing? So I got really interested in that sort of being the change. How are we that change? How are we making decisions? How are we being inclusive? How are we understanding difference in power, in rank, in terms of whose voice is heard? How are we able to, you know, to bring in the wisdom in a group? How are we able to create space where we haven't already made the decision, but we don't know? And the possibility of something new can emerge. So these were the sort of conversations, and there was a lot of learning and trainings and just making mistakes. But one thing that we always had in there was reflection, was feedback mechanisms, was after doing something, having a space where people felt comfortable to just feedback. What was their experience? And there's an aliveness to that. And this also connects to me with permaculture, which is something I began to get involved with, which is about kind of creating human systems based on principles and patterns in nature. Nature's proven itself to be sustainable, to be regenerative. And how can we bring those principles into how we create systems that may be a garden, a physical space, but also social systems? And so touched on that in terms of feedback, because nature is feedback. It is alive. It is responsive. And so in terms of campaigning, we got into climate change campaigning. We did a stunt that got in The Guardian. And this is always zero funding. We never applied for funding, and made quite a big mark, and we're kind of collaborating with different organizations. So that's kind of how my journey, and then we evolved because we learned a lot into a training organization. So offering courses, trainings on permaculture, Islamic ecology, and conscious group work or inclusive leadership. So that's kind of a nutshell sort of run through of how I got to where I am.
Thanks so much, Muzammil. Before I move on to the next prompt, and this is how it will work, everyone, I'll just have 1 or 2 prompts for Muzammil and Hira. We'll hear their thoughts about this panel, and then we'll open it up. So please start parking your questions in the chat box or get them ready before we open up in about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. But Muzammil, before I go on, you said initially that there was a name change between the London Islamic Environmental Network to Wisdom in Nature, and I guess you're trying to signal the change from environment to nature. I just wanted to know if you wanted to say something quickly about that before we go to the next round of questions.
Yeah, that was one of them, that environment indicates a separation, as and Hira touched on this as well. And it's not just about changing the name, but it's about embodying or attempting to embody that consciousness, that it's all interconnected. And it's not nature, it's not the environment where we want to center the transformation. It's us, it's the human world, but there is that interconnectedness. And wisdom in nature is it's a more descriptive term. It's also nature, the fitra as well, our inner nature, our natural state, and the wisdom that we have in that. Thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you, thanks for that. It just made me think of something else as well, because in the global scene of kind of social justice activism, the label environment has political connotations, because at some point within the UN and global system, environment became separated from other human rights concerns and social justice concerns, and it became very global north. It became related to conservation. It became largely about, to put it very bluntly, middle-class white people caring about the countryside and sheep and trees, whereas there were people dying of floods and earthquakes and everything in the global south. A lot of it as a direct result of colonialism and neocolonialism. So where did you put that? Could you talk about that in terms of in the framework of the environment? And I think that's an argument to say that you can if you talk about environmental justice, but there are these kinds of semantic loadings on these words now as well. And I thought that was interesting, like how if you say environment, it's possible to take the people out of it and only care for the animals and trees and rivers, which is not what it's about. Like the 3 of us have been saying it's quite interconnected. So thank you for that clarification. What I wanted to know next is, I think we all agree that the issues are interconnected, but I like that we're coming at it from different angles, like Hira with transport and air pollution, Uzma with permaculture, starting out as a medical doctor concerned about food systems and so on as well. I think that's brilliant. I just wanted to know, in the last year with the pandemic that's been happening, what are your reflections on that? Has that changed how you think of the issue? And if it has, how? And if it hasn't, why not? Maybe we'll go with Hira again first.
Thanks, Shannon. It definitely has. And I think it's kind of what you were touching on in your introduction, really. In a very, very short space of time, we could see how drastic change can happen when there's the political will to do so. So it's sort of when those in power decide, oh, this is going to be really, really bad if we let this roll on, we need to do something now, all of our lives can stop and change in an instant, almost. And as I was saying, growing up, knowing that this climate crisis was in the background, it's always pushed into the long grass. Whereas now we have a tangible example of actually, if you wanted to do something, you could do something, because remember, you did something here. But also it's, is when Uzma was talking about, he did all this fantastic work without funding. What's very exciting it's kind of, a double-edged sword, because in the climate charity space, there is a lot of funding right now to tackle the climate crisis. And that's because we have, as Azia was kind of touching on before, we have roughly 10 to 15 years where everyone's throwing everything they have at this issue, because after that, we're in a different landscape altogether. It's no longer about, can we prevent this catastrophe from happening? It's about, wow, how do we, it's kind of going into damage control. How do we prevent, I mean, people are going to die. There's going to be, you know, mass refugees, movements of people, floods, you know, droughts, forest fires, etc., etc. And how can we limit that? So yeah, it's there's a lot of money and a lot of people who are focusing on this issue for the next 10 years because that's what we have. So it also feels like there's a bit of a momentum in the space. And you know, Shannon, as you were saying, like, we saw cycling uptake so much during the COVID crisis. And Britain's an interesting place where I think, I was looking at the figures, something like 80% of people know how to ride a bike in Britain. And we just don't, like on a day-to-day basis, we don't. But in lockdown, you couldn't get hold of a bike because everyone got on their bikes and thought, oh, I want to go to exercise. The roads are too dangerous. Yeah, Haroon. But whilst in lockdown, we saw a reduction in traffic. That meant more people were willing to get on their bikes and get down their road. And the government's put a lot of money behind, you know, getting cycleways put into place, getting LTNs in. And what we're seeing is, from certain circles, this is turning into a bit of a culture war. And I would say progressive voices need to be aware of that, but we also need to not feed into that. We cannot turn something as serious as the climate into a cultural football that gets kicked around. I saw Nigel Farage is saying, like, oh, cycleways, oh, what are they doing to Britain, and blah, blah, blah. It's like, this is insanity. What are you talking about? Cycleways are not ruining Britain. And I feel like I've rambled on enough now at this point, so I'll stop.
No, thank you. And that uptick in cycling, I'm glad to say I'm one of the statistics that raised that as well. And Haroon, I completely agree. The roads are dangerous. Every time I take my bike out, I have to say a dua, dhikr. It doesn't do anything. I believe it saved my life when I'm on the bike, because I feel like, oh my God, London, but I still do it. And it's liberating. It's a good feeling. But anyway, Uzma, over to you.
Great, thank you. And in terms of my response to the question, which I can't quite reword, but I have a sort of vague memory of it. It's okay. I've got it enough. But I'd probably give a slightly different answer on whichever day or hour you might ask me, and that kind of also connects with, you know, I guess my what I must say is that you know, I don't have the full answer. I don't claim to have the full answer. And I think that there's so much incredible work being done, and so many perspectives that we need to take in. And the problem, the issue, the direction of travel is much more complex and beautiful than any one person or organization. And in terms of COVID, what it's done to me personally, and it's been an evolution. It's sort of personally, but it's also what I've been sensing. And that is, you know, there was a moment of panic, of insecurity, of vulnerability on a mass scale, you know, for maybe a few days or a few weeks. That there are going to be food shortages, you know, and you know, there's going to be, you know, hospitals totally full, and, you know, nobody's going to be able to get any treatment or anything. There was a real sense of panic. We felt it on our street, and very quickly that opening into the unknown began to sort of close up. And there's a sort of narrative that, and I think there was a previous, which I didn't participate in, a previous session on the story. And I think that's really important to think about. What's the story that we're being told? What's a story that is the default story that we're all embedded in? And that is almost like a promise of how the world is meant to be, how our lives are meant to be. And some of the, you know, I guess characteristics of that story is linearity and predictability. a kind of security. And I know I'm speaking this out from a somewhat privileged place as well. That's not the same for everyone. You know, there are lived experiences that are not that. You know, where climate change is already hitting people right now, or they're in areas of conflict where the world is very different to how I experience it. But there was this opening, and that quickly kind of sealed up. And you know, but it's sort of, yeah, you know, so but it sort of like gave us a peek into what could be much more endemic in terms of the impacts of climate change. I also want to, you know, there's lots of areas that could be touched on. I want to touch on inner work. I know Zika was mentioned in the previous session, and I did rebel actually a bit more, Shannon. I left medicine, and I for quite a number of years I've been practicing an emotional healing work, and I want to touch on emotions really, because if we want this transformation to be deep, we have to do emotional healing work. We have to face the fact that the story that we've been told and are living in is a story that's a lie. You know, that there's a loss, that an identity has been attached to that story, and there's grief and there's anger. And I know Joanna Macy, a Buddhist teacher, she does a lot of work around the necessity of the work that reconnects, she calls it, around you know, really facing the reality that something fundamental is not what we are told, and nor should it be. And if we want to really step into that in an embodied way, and often a lot of conversations are intellectual, and I think we need to bring our bodies, that's linked to the earth as well. So I think there's a real kind of connections, body, earth, and that body is connected to emotions. That's where we feel emotions, and that's where we release from. And to heal, we have to really face the grief that is there of this loss and the pain of that. So you know, we need to work at the different levels. We need the spiritual, we need the body, emotional, and we need the intellectual, and we need to the whole breadth of society. So we need to bring everything together. Thank you.
Thank you, Uzma. That was lovely. That reminds me, when I first came into post at Faith for the Climate early on, I just had this meeting with a Quaker activist who focuses on climate change, and she works at a UN level, so she's based in Geneva. You know, I was just touching base about the challenges, and I just said at that point, it really felt very overwhelming. And she said something like, when she first got into climate work, I mean, she was a peace activist before, and then she got into climate change work about 10 years ago. She said, yeah, for the first 1 year or so, all you can do is go, ah, like it's terrible. You think, oh my God, why am I even doing this? The world is going to end. What good can I do? I mean, I love Zia's hadith before about, you know, the Prophet ﷺ saying, if the world was going to end, all right, plant a tree. She says you do get there at some point, and the way you get there is through that emotional healing within yourself, even as you're doing the social action. Like, the combination of action and reflection and contemplation is absolutely key. So I thought that's a good place for me to prompt for my final prompt before we open up to questions. So we've talked about climate, how it's been intractable, how it's interconnected. It can be quite worrying. I want to do something different now and ask both of you, from where you are right now, what are you hopeful about with the COVID and the climate crisis? Do you have hope? If you have hope, why do you have hope? Hira.
Thank you, Shannon. I think I do have hope. And I actually think my hope comes from my faith in that. I think for me personally, to give up hope is very un-Islamic. So yes, there is hope. There is always things to be done. As Zia said, there's always a tree to be planted, and we should be planting that tree. And I think also, you know, Scott said something really interesting around, you know, the terminology changing from going from global warming to becoming climate change. But actually in the climate space, we've moved from calling climate change to calling it the climate crisis, because we're trying to get people to recognize it is a crisis. It might seem like we're not going to be in crisis mode in 10 years, but already the signs of it are more apparent. Like last year, we had the hottest, I mean, we got into 40 degrees in the UK. That's almost, that is unheard of. That's record breaking. So I have hope that as the signs of the climate crisis become more apparent, more people are motivated and activated to prevent disaster for themselves as well as our children. I can see governments making an effort, and I would, point to the Conservatives government giving so much money to implementing cycleways during the COVID crisis as one example of that. It's not the best, and no government's perfect, but we need to take our wins and celebrate them where we can. And I think for me, this is about, there are people who are going to try to make this a bipartisan issue. A partisan issue, and it shouldn't be. It's, it doesn't matter where you lie on the political spectrum or how you yourself identify. This is about humanity. So I think for me, there is a lot of hope. And maybe that's because, I need to hope. I think I've got many years ahead of me, I hope. And so to give up hope now would be the wrong approach.
Thanks, Hira. Muzammil.
When you put that question, I was lost for words, and I thought, I'm glad Hira's going first. And I was wondering what is it that makes me a bit uncomfortable about the question? Not that there's anything wrong with the question, and that was because I'm not. I guess where I'm coming to my own journey is more acceptance than hope, and if that sounds a cop-out, I mean, it is as it is. That's what it is. It's for me, I'm just finding that the more I can fully be present to what is, and not fear or face the fear, to really meet whatever sort of internal turbulence that this brings up for me. And an acceptance of that then I'm more present to what the possibilities are. So I'm kind of, I guess, more, yeah. I mean, I may give a different answer if I was having a different internal sort of experience, but that's kind of where I sit. And I think okay, maybe I can move on to hope now. Is what gives me hope in a sort of wider sense is the coming together of so many different energies in the world. When we were sort of, into sort of 2008, 2009, when at Wisdom in Nature, we were starting to knit the issues together, and we developed a sort of 5-strand activism model, weaving, sort of group work, inner change, economics, with climate change, and also it's kind of non-violent activism and so forth, and it was like not really understood. But it's sort of, what gives me hope is that the inner, the outer, and the kind of, I guess, the different shades of experience in our, in our world, that there's a huge richness of different perspectives and ways that is sort of coming together. And I think one of the things I love about permaculture is that too that's about sort of empowering people to do what is possible within their context. And there's a kind of principle in permaculture, small and slow solutions. And that if we focus on what is close to our power and begin to create something that is transformative within that, then, and this woman, Morai Gamble, who gave a talk at the Permaculture Convergence, she sort of responded, how can you use permaculture, something that's small and slow, in a situation of urgency? And she said, you can only do small and slow. But what you need to do is communicate and myceliate. And just like the fungi network underground connects up, that it's those small, slow solutions with the connecting up, that then there's a moment where you can have this, something that was unseen, that can just come out, some bigger story that can emerge from those small, slow, myceliated solutions. And I can see that taking place, you know, in the space, some of the spaces where I put my ear to.
Thank you so much. And thanks for complicating the question, because, you know, I completely agree. People come at these issues from different angles. What looks like hope to someone looks like delusion to someone else, or it could be not enough hope for someone else. And I guess this is why I wanted this panel to happen in this way as well, because as I said, it can feel really daunting. And if we sort of unpack the issues in our own way and then find those solutions and come together and discuss them, I think for me, well, that's where I draw my hope from. Thank you so much to both of you. I'd like to open it to questions now. I think Hira has already addressed Scott's comment in the chat box about global warming being changed to climate change, and then Hira has actually expanded on that, why activists want it to be called the climate crisis now. There's something by Timothy Bartel in the chat box. Timothy, I wondered if you wanted to speak to that, if you wanted to elaborate on that.
Yeah. No, it was intended as a passing comment, but if the panel want to comment on that particular topic, they're most welcome to do so.
Are you referring to the Brexit transition?
I'm afraid I am.
Yeah, okay. So the B word appears.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because what I would say is towards the beginning of the year, when, you know, David Cameron had got his great victory, that's all, you know, he wanted to talk about was Brexit, and we'll get Brexit done. And then I feel that, you know, in some ways, how God humbles us, you know, because coronavirus came along and it's not the victory he thought it was going to be during his premiership. But what I would say about Brexit is that Britain was a very, very divided country. I mean, in many ways it still is divided, but the ruptures were so apparent, and the dialogue and the conversations were getting so ugly. Even generational rifts. I remember with Brexit, it's like, oh, look at what all these old people have done to us. And the rhetoric around it was getting so ugly. And then COVID-19 happened. And again, the conversation changed. It was now, you know, we must protect our elders. We have to, you know, social distance for the sake of our elders. And, you know, so I thought that it was a healing moment. And then, as Shannon pointed out, a couple of months later, when we started realizing that actually a lot more ethnic minority people were dying disproportionately, people on low wages were dying disproportionately, frontline services, you know, have been decimated for so long, and now, you know, the country is reaping what the government has sowed. It's been a tough time, a roller coaster of a time, and I think you're absolutely right. Come January, the conversations will turn again. But going back to hope, Uzma, this is why I'm hopeful, because things change all the time. You never know what's around the corner, and so I'm ever hopeful that there will be something around the corner.
Thank you, Hira. Muzammil, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, if Hira interpreted what I said as don't be hopeful, that's not what I was intending. The myceliate and something, you know, can suddenly emerge, I hope, also gives hope. And I'm pleased you're hopeful as well, Hira. I mean, I kind of feel a bit overwhelmed actually with Brexit. And I was very involved kind of with, you know, following it and sort of getting into to conversations and attempts at dialogue around it. And I you know, I guess what I want to say about what it brings up for me is polarization. And I guess the you know, so I'm not responding directly to the question actually, but this is, I think, really for me, I feel really relevant to where we are, and some of what is needed is how can we relate to people who we fundamentally disagree with. How can we relate to people who are tyrants, who hate? How do we relate to them? To people who hate other groups of people. And do we demonize them? Do we kind of create narratives that are about giving them absolutely no validity? And I think that if we want to be progressive and healing, that we need to go deeper than that. And I'm even referring to Trump here as well. That there's a kind of deeper I guess experience from which this emerges, and each of us have stories that lead us to being where we are. And if we want to be truly progressive, then I think that we need to reach in us and find the Trump in us. The Quran has a lot of stories, and I think that they're really archetypes of what we find in ourselves. So if we want to really heal, then it's, or how do we want other groups of people who think we are evil? How do we want them to relate to us? So who's going to go first here? I think that painful work is absolutely so necessary, to have spaces where we can be comfortable being uncomfortable, and kind of really open our hearts up to things, to even evil.
Thanks so much, Muzama. I think I have two people in the queue, Zia and then Giles, but I just wanted to, something you said about speaking with people that make us uncomfortable and so on. I find that working in a Muslim space, talking about climate, there is lots more Islamic environmentalism now that talks about different things like agriculture, the kind of food that we eat and so on, land use. But my biggest bugbear now with climate change is the Gulf kingdoms, Saudi Arabia, and fossil fuel extraction, and just what it's used to fund the wars that it gets involved in, but also the mosques that it funds, and also the population over the last 5 decades that's just become hooked on subsidies. In the Gulf, you have lifestyles where it's 2.5 times the consumption burden of the rest of the planet, because they have shopping malls that have skating rinks and they drive SUVs. And this is a direct result of what the oil economy has done in that region and what it contributes to climate change now. And if we want to hold governments like the US and Australia and so on to account, surely as Muslims, we have to think about how do we hold the custodians of the 2 holy cities to account as well, right? And I have to find my inner house of sound to do that as well. I have to find my inner Mohammed bin Salman. Like, how am I going to do this? But anyway, I don't know. Zia, did you want to come in on that? And then Giles.
No, this is getting into a strange space. The hope, I would say, we are the Muslim Institute, and I would say that hope is the definition of a believer. The Prophet said, trust in Allah. That's where hope comes from. So if we always trust in Allah, then we are always hopeful. This is why despair is haram, is forbidden in Islam. Right? So hope is for me, that's my definition of being a Muslim. Right? I am always hopeful. But there's also, there's a difference between acceptance, as Muslims said, and change and hope. Hope takes you towards change, that there can be change. Right. So the Prophet said, trust in Allah, but tie your camel.
Yes.
So we trust in Allah, but we act to change the world, right? In a sense. That's also part of our faith. So for me, Islam is all about changing the world for the better, in a sense. That has to be there. And change is something that can always happen. And nowadays, of course, it happens faster and faster, but we have examples in history where total cultures and civilization and societies had been transformed within a year, within a generation. So change can take place within a generation. Yeah. Right? A best example is Prophet's life, 23 years of prophethood. He transformed little old Mecca from a pagan society and turned into a civilization within 23 years, right? I mean, and Ibn Khaldun said, you know, the famous theory of cyclic theory of history is that each generation, there are 4 generations, history moves in 4 generations. The first generation creates wealth and ideas. The second generation adds very little, but uses most of it. Third generation doesn't add anything at all. And fourth generation, in fact, basically collapses and you have to restart the cycle. So he also is telling us that things can change within a generation. And we know that things can change within a generation. Hope, and especially young people that I see here, provide a good example. Muzammil, you said, I love the idea of wisdom in nature. And here, nature is defined not in the kind of Western conception as it's about wildlife and gardens and forests and rivers and trees, but something that is fitra, which is very, very important. Right? Fitra is the innate nature of man. Right? It is what defines us as human beings. That's what nature is about, in a sense. So nature is innate to us. It's not the other, but it is. It's not even interconnected, but it is us in a sense, right? We are not just interconnected with nature, but we are nature in part of. That's what fitra means. So I would like to ask you a question. Recent developments have shown that the very nature of human nature is about to change. Right? That what it means to be human will be transformed by genetic engineering. We already know to a very large extent that some new developments in genetic engineering have had profound impact on various societies. So for example, an example I give of India, where they first introduced elementary genetic engineering, and it's a big report I was reading in Nature. One of the first people to pick it up were middle-class women who went to the doctors and said, can I have a baby that's like doodh ki tarah, like white as milk. Similar kind of eugenic stuff is coming out of the United States and certainly from China, right? So what is your take on genetic engineering in nature? Especially when you worked on GM foods earlier on, right? And in fact, I did a lot of research, and when I was working for New Scientist long time ago, I used to write about genetic engineering. In fact, even when I was working for New Statesman, I wrote a couple of very large pieces on genetically modified food. So what is your approach to genetic engineering, which is a very important future technology that will have profound impact on us and on our nature?
Yeah. How much time do we have left?
Not much, but go for it. Yeah. And then you have 2 questions after this, but yeah.
Yeah, and I'll let go of the hope and acceptance one, but just that there could be more to be said around that, and there's a possibility of bypassing what is our real experience as well. So I just want to bring that in, and a radical honesty in that. In terms of where I came to with genetic engineering, and my focus was largely on food. I mean, in terms of genetic, let's just give another example. Genetic engineering in terms of medicines is a slightly different situation. If the genetically modified organisms are kept in controlled conditions and they're not escaping into nature, and there's some talk that even the virus could have come leaked from a laboratory in or near Wuhan that was working on genetic modification, and the animal theory doesn't have as much credibility because it was a bit of a jump in terms of the genetic code that could more easily be explained by genetic engineering. So I just want to bring that in, that we don't really know the cause of COVID, for instance, and let's keep that in the picture. That won't be acceptable by the mainstream because GM is pushed by the mainstream. In terms of food, it's an imprecise, it's getting more precise, but it is imprecise technology. And you're releasing living organisms into the living environment where they can cross-pollinate with other organisms. But it's also, where there's a lack of food, the problem, or where people are starving, for instance, the problem isn't a lack of food, it's that food isn't getting to where it needs to go. And often it's this linear model and paradigm of, that we can control nature, that I think is part of the pathology that means that we are going to lose, because we're trying to win and beat something that is more complex than, and that has its laws and principles that we're not honoring. So I think there are social and economic ways around food and making sure that there's access for those that have less. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I sort of lost my thread there, but that's.
But that's okay, because I think
yeah.
we've got okay, we are at 4 o'clock, but we started a bit late. I know that Uzma and Giles have questions. I'm going to take them at the same time. Uzma and Giles, if you can do your questions in one line, and then Hira and Muzammil, if you can just answer in less than a minute, and then we'll wrap up. So Giles and Uzma.
I'm not sure I can do it in one line, but I think one of the reasons that climate change is getting the attention it's getting is because the rich world sees it in its own interest now. So there's a lot of self-interest in, at the moment there's a thing going on the other side, and Xi Jinping and Boris Johnson and Guterres, and they've all just spoken about their promises about climate change. My hope is that we can reverse climate change. My fear is that the world will still be the same at the end of it. It'll still be unjust. There'll still be people, the homeless people, there'll still be refugees. How can we learn from what may be happening in terms of bringing people together on climate change to make the world better in other ways as well?
Thank you, Giles. Uzma.
It touches, I suppose, a little bit on economics, but in a different sort of grassroots way. My question is both to Hira and Muzammil. I'm wondering, stereotypically, the climate space of climate activism is seen as a very middle class thing, and I'm wondering whether or not talking in Islamic terms and talking to Muslims about climate change in theology that they understand, whether or not that, from your personal experience, has impacted the socioeconomics of that activist space, and whether or not people have had successes in mobilizing, like traditionally working class Muslim communities.
Thank you. Okay, Hira and Muzammil, 1 minute.
Okay, the pressure. Giles, I agree with you. I think the push is coming from the fact that people are thinking, oh my goodness, this is actually going to impact me. Oh, we need to do something, rather than any sort of virtuous kind of thing. But I believe that the world, kind of what Muzammil was saying, I accept that this world will almost always be unjust. But our role as believers is to always work for better. So the aim is always we're brought into this world and leave it better than the way it was when we came in. That's all I'll say on that. And Uzma, in terms of, yes, talking in Islamic terms about climate change, I would just say talking in a more accessible terms to whoever you're talking to, whether they're Muslim or not. And I think Possible really tries to do that. We try not to use jargon. We try not to, we try to put things in really easy to understand language without trying to beat around the bush. And I think as people begin to see the effects of climate change on their own lives, which I think people in Tower Hamlets are seeing, we've seen a shift in the way communities themselves think about the issue. So it's a collective awakening, which I think will only increase as the effects of climate change become more apparent. I'm sorry, that wasn't a full answer, but I'll leave it there.
That's all right. It's impossible to give a full answer at this point. Muzammil, did you want to have a stab?
Yeah, I mean, these are complex, big questions. Good to hear that they are being thrown in. I'm going to pick on the point in Giles' question first around something about when we bring people together on climate change, can we bring them together for other things as well? And I want to just bring in something I'm cautious about with climate change is the paradigm of carbon domination, where it becomes that it's all about simply the mathematics of carbon. And while I have a lot of respect for Extinction Rebellion, I think one of its kind of, I guess, how it articulates the problem is very, very empirical, both in terms of carbon, for instance, and in terms of you need X number of people activated, X percentage, and so forth. And I think the sort of qualitative aspect, and but it does bring a lot of, I think, beauty as well. I think it's done some amazing stuff. But the fixation on just carbon, it's something much deeper, and that, what is it? What's the paradigm that has led to climate change as a symptom? Can connect us in so many levels. Can connect us. It's you could say, well, maybe it's the kind of disruption of community. And what is community? It's about people who are different coming together. It's about people, kind of caring about each other's needs. So I believe that it can do that.
Muzammil, I'm afraid I'll have to stop there because it is 5 minutes. But that's a really good place to stop. What is a community, and how can we talked about a sense of belonging as well earlier in one of the earlier sessions, and I think what you're speaking to really connects with that. I'd like to thank both of you so much for a wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed this. To everyone else, thank you for your questions. You can check out our organizations. There's Faith for the Climate, there's Possible, there's Wisdom in Nature. Please ask us if you have any questions. And also, I'd like to say a special thank you. Just give a special debt of gratitude to Zia, who has actually been writing a lot on Islam and the environment and the ecology long before it became fashionable. So there's also Zia's body of work that we can revisit. So thank you so much, everyone. I will hand over now to Uzma. Oh, and sorry, I wanted to say as well in the chat box, Layla put in, I don't know if any one of you has seen, this is really good. I think this is lovely. Layla says the word Iblis comes from the Arabic verb to despair, according to one interpretation. So I think that's really interesting as well. So thank you so much, everyone. Sorry it's gone over. Uzma, over to you.